Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to Other Minds and Hands. This is episode number 56, and today I am joined, as always, by Maggie Parke. Hey there, Maggie. And I am, as always, Corey Olsen, and today we return for installment number 4 of our opening series, where we continue to do a case study of looking at the openings, specifically comparing books and multiple film adaptations, thinking about how they are approaching what we learn from these openings about what they're, what they're broadcasting about the start, like where they're placing us as an audience at the start. But in addition, the other additional thing there is that we're focusing on the how. Right, looking at this as a case study to really see how is it that films are communicating compared to the book, and also but by looking at the two different, we get a couple different angles on that. And at the risk, I'm going to run a little risk here of bringing up our topic from last week, risking a digression into continuing to talk about Pride and Prejudice for another half hour, but. It has really changed a lot of my thinking. Last time was such a fascinating example. Like when you look at, and I'm thinking here especially of the Keira Knightley Pride and Prejudice. What would you say? Who's the Ron Knight? Was it? Right.
John Wright.
John Wright. Oh, so close. I had the vowels mostly correct. Joe Wright. Joe Wright. That was it. Anyway, the Joe Wright production. I want to give credit to the actual director who, whose vision this was. The Joe Wright opening versus the book opening is such a remarkable contrast between what you can do really well in film and what you can do really well in the book. Right? Jane Austen in the book starts off with those really wonderful general sentences, right, which do a really sophisticated, complicated job of placing us in a particular place, and then boom, straight into dialogue, right? Mm-hmm. And again, she's taking advantage of the fact that since we're reading the book, we're in control of the pace, right? So if we miss something, if we pick up on something later in the conversation, we can go back if we want to, right? There's you can pause and think things through, where you don't get that leisure in a film, right? So anyway, so there's all this depth and richness of not wordplay exactly. She's not making puns and things, but which again we see things happening on so many levels during that exchange between Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, which dominates Chapter 1 of Pride and Prejudice. Then in the Joe Wright version of the film, we get no dialogue, and it's just camera pan, just landscapes and camera panning. Right, and that's all that we get as the camera travels across the whole area, and we get this full introduction to the general setting, the sort of the general England and beautiful countryside, right, and the specific setting of this house and this family and the particular people and the issues going on and the taste that we get of all these things, all with no words whatsoever, which of course is theoretically impossible in a book, right? Unless it's like a graphic novel with a long nonverbal entry of multiple, just pictorial panels. But anyway, it's just, you can't do that in a book. So what he accomplishes there is that contrast between Chapter 1 of Pride and Prejudice, the text, and the opening 2 minutes of the Joe Wright Pride and Prejudice film adaptation is such, which it's so illuminating to me to really try to put your finger on how they do things differently.
And I don't mind at all that we harken back to Pride and Prejudice, because we're talking about Sense and Sensibility today, and I feel like discussing the two, not in comparison, I don't think we'll go back and forth, but in progression is really interesting. And they just tell the story in such different ways. The thing I was thinking about after we finished last week was the tone of the comparisons is what I find so interesting. So the text, we had information on cultural mores that was deemed important first. So what is that kind of baseline foundation that our creator wants us to know before we engage in the tale? For Jane Austen, it was societal mores.
Right.
For
expectations
Joe
about
Wright,
marriage and
for Joe Wright, it was pace, it was beauty, it was setting. You'll get absorbed into this story, I don't have to explain everything to you. And it's explained to you in different ways, visually, tonally and costume and things like that. But it's not this like list of explanation. And the BBC one's kind of somewhere in between the two, and it's just told a different perspective. Today, we're going to see quite a few different ways that our creator thinks that we need to see things first off. So
absolutely.
Yeah, I love having the case study to look at these things, though, because it just shows you, like, we're not just talking about text to screen, we're talking about authorial intent. So creator intent is so big with adaptation.
Yes.
That Joe Wright's purpose was to be faithful and tell a story.
Yes.
Emma Thompson's was to be faithful and tell a beautiful story, so like she walked that line, which we'll get to, of how to kind of try to marry those two things. And yeah, it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, and it is such a different, I mean, again, it really it helps to contextualize. We've often talked about things like we've frequently said in the history of Other Minds and Hands that you shouldn't go into an adaptation just grinding an axe about faithfulness, right? And being ready to be angry and resistant. But again, one of the things that I'm really enjoying about this case study is it really helps to see what exactly that means, right? If you ask the question, is the opening of the Joe Wright Pride and Prejudice faithful to the book? Like, how do you even answer that question? Right? I mean, it's doing something quite different and in a completely different way, an almost opposite way, right? But does that mean it's not faithful? Like, it just we've been saying, and we've been saying for a year and a half, right, that like the question of is it faithful to the text is a much more complicated question than can be answered in like a set of checklists.
Not the right it's not the right question.
It's not the right question at all. And this is so to try to appreciate not only the two different stories that they're telling, but the ways in which they're telling stories and trying to judge them on their own basis and to I mean, I like the way you were just putting that about the Joe Wright, like where the Joe Wright version is putting us, right? The kind of reaction that first scene, right? When we were staring at that one landscape, nothing changing, nothing happening on screen for like 30 seconds, which felt like forever, right?
Well, and remember our conversation about shots where like most shots are 4 to 6 seconds. If you've anything longer than 8 seconds, that is a significant establishment shot that the director wants you to sit with something. That was 35 seconds long.
And there was nothing like special. Like, it wasn't like you were seeing a scene, like a landscape that's going to be important later on or something. It was just a shot, a landscape shot.
And I also love, that was like, oh God, what year was that? I was working in the cinema. That was like 2006, maybe, that came out. That was before how divided our attention is now. Like that, I think, would be an amazing directorial trick now to get people to focus, because we never focus anymore. We're checking our phones, we're checking this, we're hearing as an audience member, making that decision in 2006 to sit them there and slow the pace down and make them sit and engage. I love that. Yeah. I'm amazed we don't see it more from directors now.
No, it's very interesting. The first time that and the other thing that strikes me, that makes me feel like what you were just saying about the kind of, I don't know what culture, right, of the Joe Wright adaptation, it seems exactly correct, is that, when I kind of came around on it, the first time I watched it, which was soon after it came out, I was still doing it wrong. Like I was, there were a lot of things. My wife and I saw it together, and we were very like, oh man, there's a lot of things we don't, we thought a lot of departures from the book that we didn't like and everything. But I was realizing it I began to appreciate it on its own ground when I saw it on a plane, not when I watched it on my screen on a plane. But when I was sitting in a window seat, when the person in the middle seat in the row in front of me was watching it on the plane, which means it was right in my field of vision whenever I looked up from my laptop, right, which I was working on. Every time I looked up, there it is on the screen right in front of me that I can see between the two seats right in front of me. In other words, I got no sound at all. All I got was I would occasionally look up, and there is beauty on the screen, right? Mm-hmm. And I kept looking up, and I knew what it was. I mean, I knew what it was, and of course, and I know the book well enough to like look up out of context and know exactly the moment in the story that is being depicted. Mm-hmm. Even because I couldn't even read captions from there. But again, but every time I was like, okay, that's really beautiful. And like the way in which that adaptation is really driven, as you say, the initial scenes, they tell us the language of that production, and that's consistent, I think, throughout, and that's really interesting to pay attention to. And
that's also a really good exercise for people to just try, is watching. You don't have to watch the whole film if you don't want, but watching a film without any sound, or watching a film if you have a mixer that you can take out the dialogue and just listen to the music over the images. Like, there's so many different ways that the story is told that I think you just get a lot from it. But hitting mute is probably the easiest way to just kind of get a vibe. But commit to like 3 or 4 scenes and just try to watch one of your favorite films without anything on top of it. It's just a really interesting exercise.
It helps draw attention to the different elements that you would normally take for granted.
Especially when you do know well, because you do fill in those gaps. And it just kind of gives you that like example of like, this is what an adaptation does. You will fill in the gaps, but it has to give you the focal points to be able to fill those gaps in well enough. And it's sometimes when those bullet points are missing that everything falls apart a little bit. We forgot to give the reminder for next week.
Oh, we forgot to give the reminder for next week. Oh, that's right. We got to just jump straight into Jane Austen. We're going to come back to Jane Austen in just a second, but we'll announce this again at the end. We'll remind you again at the end. But we did want to announce we have a special session. We're going to interrupt our openings series next week, because next week we're going to be joined by some special guests. We will have some core members of the development team of the new Return to Moria game joining us next week. So next week we're going to be talking about, so of course the Return to Moria game was just released on PC last week. So it's still a brand new game. Lots of people are talking about it. It's probably like the biggest new Tolkien adaptation that's out there right now. So we're gonna talk about that. Of course, we're gonna be talking about it in the context of we're going to be talking about it in the context of looking at the adaptation process and thinking, because we have not done yet. It's something we've always been kind of meaning to get around to, but we have not yet done thinking about the kind of adaptation choices that are involved in using a medium like video games, which has, of course, some similarities with film adaptation, but some significant differences, obviously. And so what's at stake there? What is that process like? And how does that inform thinking through a video game as adaptation? So we're going to be joined by the game director, by the head writer, and the art director of Return to Moria.
And the consultant.
And the consultant. Yes, exactly. I did consult on that game. So anyway, so that's going to be a lot of fun. So we'll have that team with us next time. We'll be talking about Tolkien. We'll be talking about dwarves. We'll be talking about video game adaptations. Definitely, bring questions and things that you would have there, because we'll try to do what we can to take questions and stuff about the game. And about, of course, focusing on the adaptation discussion as we always do. So that's going to be happening. Next week. Thanks for the reminder again.
I'm pretty excited about it.
Austin and totally forget.
And I don't have the game yet, so we were talking about what you guys can do, because don't feel like you have to go out and buy it tomorrow or anything. Right. But watch the trailer on YouTube and just engage in some of the stuff that's out there. Matt Nerd of the Rings has a really good piece, and I think Nubita did one on TikTok as well. Yeah. There's a bunch of things that are out there of just people talking about it, so it's worth engaging a little bit before you come next week.
Yeah, you can get a little bit of a taste of what the game is about and where it's kind of set, like what story it is adapting and things. So anyway, you can definitely check it. You can check out some game streams. Yeah, there'll be a bunch of options for getting a little sampling of it.
So we'll dip back into our Tolkien after our intro sesh, but for tonight we'll return to Jane Austen.
That's right. Okay. Yes. Now back to Austen. So tonight, Sense and Sensibility.
About an hour. Game on.
Here we go. Sense and Sensibility in an hour. This time, I think I'm not going to read the whole first chapter, but we'll read the first couple paragraphs, and we will, and then I think we kind of skim and see like where it goes in the rest of the first chapter, which I think is interesting. Well, I know it's gonna contrast interestingly with what we're gonna see in both of the film adaptations. Okay.
Yeah.
Chapter 1. The family of Dashwood had long been settled in Sussex. Their estate was large, and their residence was at Norland Park, in the centre of their property, where for many generations they had lived in so respectable a manner as to engage the general good opinion of their surrounding acquaintance. Anyone else getting a Bilbo Baggins vibe? That sounds to me so much like the beginning of The Hobbit. The late owner of this estate was a single man who lived to a very advanced age, and who for many years of his life had a constant companion and housekeeper in his sister. But her death, which happened 10 years before his own, produced a great alteration in his home, for to supply her loss, he invited and received into his house the family of his nephew, Mr. Henry Dashwood, the legal inheritor of the Norland estate, and the person to whom he intended to bequeath it. In the society of his nephew and niece and their children, the old gentleman's days were comfortably spent. His attachment to them all increased. The constant attention of Mr. and Mrs. Henry Dashwood to his wishes, which proceeded not merely from interest, but from goodness of heart, gave him every degree of solid comfort which his age could receive, and the cheerfulness of the children added a relish to his existence. By a former marriage, Mr. Henry Dashwood had one son, by his present lady 3 daughters. The son, a steady, respectable young man, was amply provided for by the fortune of his mother, which had been large, and half of which had devolved on him on his coming of age. By his own marriage likewise, which happened soon afterwards, he added to his wealth. To him, therefore, the succession to the Norland estate was not so really important as to his sisters, for their fortune, independent of what might arise to them from their fathers inheriting that property, could be but small. Their mother had nothing, and their father only £7,000 in his own disposal, for the remaining moiety of his first wife's fortune was also secured to her child, and he had only a life interest in it. Okay, there's our first 2 paragraphs, right? Which, first of all, you'll notice after the 2 short sentences, which made up the 2 first, long sentences, but 2 sentences, each one of which was an independent paragraph at the beginning of Pride and Prejudice. We have these quite long paragraphs here at the beginning of Sense and Sensibility. Now, what do we learn? What do we learn from the beginning of? And I will. Okay, I said I would sketch ahead. I'll sketch ahead to the rest of the rest of the chapter, which is pretty long, right? So then the old guy dies, right? And we have his will, right? His will leaves the property to Mr. Henry, but after him to his son by his first marriage, instead of he can't leave the property to his 3 daughters.
Right.
So the one son who is already rich, which she told us about, and the 3 daughters which are poor and they can get nothing. And then the old guy dies and they inherit the property, and then Mr. Henry Dashwood dies a year later and is frustrated that he can't leave the money to his wife and daughters. And Mr. John Dashwood, his first son, inherits the property, and the father
begs him.
Yeah, the father begs him to remember his sisters, his stepmother and his 3 sisters, and to take care of them. And the son promises to do this. And he makes a plan of giving them a significant amount of money to help to support them now that he's gotten this extra windfall. Then we learn about how his wife, Mr. John Dashwood, the one who inherits the money and is supposed to help his sisters, how his wife immediately moves in to Norland Park, which is legally theirs now, but in which, of course, the mother and 3 sisters have lived, the stepmother and 3 sisters have lived their whole, for many years.
Just lost their father.
Just lost their father, and now these strangers come and sort of displace them. Mrs. Dashwood is really upset about this, and this leads to sort of character sketches of Mrs. Dashwood, and then of a paragraph each to Eleanor and to Marianne, and to Margaret at the end, with a paragraph in the middle about Eleanor's assessment of the situation. So
very well summarized.
It's long. It's long and it's complicated. It's again very different from the opening.
It's very different.
Paragraph.
Complicated is the word I would use too, because I had to reread that first paragraph so many times, and I haven't read this one in probably 3 or 4 years. So I had to reread the first bit a couple of times, even knowing the film so well this time. But it is a little complicated. But I like how you kind of summed that up, that we similarly to Pride and Prejudice and to Hobbit, I didn't recognize that correlation, but it's true. You start with societal instruction, you start with like, this is how things work. And then by the end of the chapter, we have character sketches of the people that we need to care about. So it's like, here's what you need to understand. It's more of that foundation laying. And then you get, here's who's going to play this out.
Yeah.
But it is a little drier.
It's much drier. It's hard. It's hard not to, I feel this way, and I think I can't imagine there are very many people who don't feel this way. That this is probably my least favorite opening of any Jane Austen novel. Like, it's
not engaging.
Who loves these first paragraphs, right?
It feels very instructional, and I'm like, what? It's like why I didn't like Game of Thrones for so long. I just could not understand who was who. Give me a chart.
Right. Yeah, no, it's very complicated. And she does a kind of bait and switch in it. Like, the first paragraph is all about Mr. Dashwood, the elder Mr. Dashwood, who lived to a great age. And not only does it turn out that we don't care about him because he's going to die on page 2, right? And his will is what's important. But we don't even care about, we only care indirectly about Mr. Henry Dashwood, the guy. So here's the story about a guy. Okay, it's a story about a guy. And this other guy's family moved in with him. Okay, all right, guy, another guy's family moved in with him. And then both of them die, right? Both of them die within a year, like within a year of each other and within a couple pages of the beginning. So, in fact, what we learn by the end of the paragraph is what we care about are the third generation here, like the children involved. When he came in with his wife and all of his kids, it's those kids in that generation. That's who we care about. That's who this story is about.
And I wonder what her purpose in doing that was, like just to show that is the normalcy. Like, we are going to go through 3 generations in a hot second, because that's what happens to some of these highborn women. These were highborn women in this incredible home, hosting massive balls and having grand pianos and big dinners and fancy outfits and all this, and then all of a sudden they got nothing. Right. So, growing up as a woman, she was probably quite familiar with that happening to some of her acquaintances.
Yeah, you're right that so I didn't quite get to one of the one of the most famous passages, I think, of this paragraph is basically why did the old man, the original old man, why in his will? So he makes a will. By the way, the fact that I feel like this needs explanation is part of the issue with this chapter. Like, almost everybody needs a chart for
We're
the
still
first
here.
chapter of Sense and Sensibility, right? Okay, so the old man, so Henry has moved in with him. Henry and Henry's family. Henry is the one who is married twice, right? Henry's first marriage had 1 child, which is John. And his second marriage has the 3 daughters who are the women that we care about in the book, right? And the old guy met John when he was a kid, right? And so he tells that story. So when he dies, the old man leaves his property to Henry, but he doesn't leave it to him free. He stipulates in his will that, like, yes, Henry, you get the land, but you have to leave the land to John. Like basically he's saying, I want Little John to inherit the state after. I've met Little John and I want Little Johnny to be my heir, right? Is what the old man decides. And of course he leaves it to Henry. It's not like he's going to like just leave it directly to John and cut out John's father entirely, right? Like, yes, Henry, you can stay, you can have it while you're alive, but you have to leave it to little Johnny, right? And that's and why does he do this? Why does he make this choice to leave his whole estate to little Johnny, to mandate that Henry leaves the estate entirely to little Johnny? And he gives she gives a description of it. The whole was tied up for the benefit of this child, who, in occasional visits with his father and mother at Norland, had so far gained on the affections of his uncle by such attractions as are by no means unusual in children of 2 or 3 years old. An imperfect articulation, an earnest desire of having his own way, many cunning tricks, and a great deal of noise, as to outweigh all the value of all the attention which for years he had received from his niece and her daughters. So yeah, Maggie, what you were talking about, oh, by the way, we once had a baby bib that said many cunning tricks and a great deal of noise.
I like
on it.
That.
Yeah,
I'm like, as you were describing it, I'm like, this is very familiar to me.
Exactly, yeah. Yes. An earnest desire of having her own way. Yes. Is this resonating with you? You've got a toddler in the house.
Such a beautiful way to say stubborn as heck.
Yes, exactly.
Earnest desire to have her own way. I'm getting that on a t-shirt. That's amazing.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yes, for that to replace the relations that have been there before.
Yeah, exactly. But anyway, going back to what you were saying about how, in particular, women are can, like, their circumstances can change in a heartbeat. Like how women tend not at all to be master of their own destinies as far as their social and financial well-being is concerned.
Mm-hmm. And that was a question I wanted to ask you because I couldn't find it in the text, but I didn't have a ton of time. In the Emma Thompson adaptation, she actually has a line, "We can't even earn our money."
Yes.
Was that in the original text, or was that an Emma Thompson ad?
It's one of the things that I think Jane Austen didn't have to say, because like a message for the benefit of the late 20th century audience, who might be thinking, why didn't they just get jobs, right? They can't do that.
No.
Right? Yeah, whereas the Jane Austen would never even have thought of that. So like, it was known they couldn't get jobs. Or rather, I should say more accurately, they couldn't get jobs without entirely departing from their social sphere.
Their life, right. If they had gotten a job, they wouldn't be part of the world that they were in.
They could have become like governesses like Jane Eyre, but in doing so, they are departing from the social sphere of like gentlemen and gentleman society entirely. And so therefore the question, of course, here in Pride and Prejudice, it is a truth universally acknowledged that any single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. In Sense and Sensibility, we are living with three young women who are high, in that sort of level of society, but have the only way that they can continue their life is by finding a rich husband. Like they are completely helpless. The only power that they have is the hope somehow of attracting a good husband. But of course, husbands are interested in money too, and they have none. So that's another sort of reality there. The reality, by the way, which the opening sentence of Pride and Prejudice is flamboyantly ignoring, right? That is to say, you could add a writer to it. It is a truth universally acknowledged, right? That a single man in possession of good fortune must be in want of a wife, and would and is very likely interested in a young woman of significant fortune as well, right? I mean, like that's like anyway.
Willoughby.
Exactly. But anyway, the way, so we're given one way to characterize the opening of Sense and Sensibility is to say we're like invested in the whole legal situation, like the whole situation of legacy, the bait and switch, right, of starting with old Mr. Dashwood, whose first name we never even learn, right? He's just old Mr. Dashwood, who we don't care about apart from the fact that he's going to write a will, right? But that will is going to be determining the destiny of people 2 generations down the road. And that's exactly why is it that Eleanor and Marianne and Margaret are in the position that they're in? Because of the will of old Mr. Dashwood, right? And so what it ends up illustrating is how these things come. And we're told, like, why? Because he thought little Johnny was cute when he was 2, right? There was nothing special about him. He was acting like a toddler, which the old man found endearing. And so he decided he was going to leave his... And there's even a gentle accusation of injustice here, right?
Yeah.
That same old man lived with the 3 daughters for years.
Who looked after him.
After him and cared for him and did good things for him. And yet he chose not exactly to disinherit them, but to prevent them from being able to be supported by his estate.
And it really does just kind of illustrate like what the stake, I don't know, the worth of women might have been at that point, because for him to just kind of casually look over them, he didn't even notice, like, oh, they're cute, but that kid's cuter.
Right.
You know? To just be completely disregarded. And, you know, that's a real viable fear that I think is clever to have been written in.
Yeah. Or to say, or for him to basically, I mean, the implication seems to me that he was probably, without himself thinking about it very much, focused on the boy child. You know, you've got the 1 boy child and the 3 girl children, right? But
he was just so naturally focused on the man.
Right. This is the heir that I want to be the lord of the estate, you know, later on.
What a broken system.
Yeah, exactly. No, but again, it's not just that like the laws of, you know, of inheritance. He could have done more. Like, it would have been one thing to say John gets Norland Park, but I'm not even that he had to set it aside, that I'm going to allow Henry, the father of the girls, to set aside large marriage portions out of the inheritance. He could have done that. He could have realized cash to say, like, yes, John gets the house, right? John gets the land, but I'm going to, out of this money, like out of the estate, I'm going to set aside 10,000 a piece or 20,000 a piece for the girls for marriage portions. But Henry legally can't do that because of the way that old Mr. Dashwood wrote his will. So it's really thoughtless. I mean, like you don't get the impression that old Mr. Dashwood was horrible, you know, that he meant to harm the girls. But it was a thoughtlessly written will, and now there are these massive consequences to, you know, the rather arbitrary choice. So it's interesting because it is a very personal situation. Like there's real personal drama involved there, and yet I think there's a sense in which I almost think the beginning of this book is supposed to be boring. Right? Yeah. It's like, from such matters of inheritance and legacy, like, this is how things, like, yes, we're starting with a heroine who is in a tenuous situation, right? Because of, like, circumstances of her birth and family. But instead of just starting the chapter there, right? She could have done that, right? She could have been like, Eleanor Dashwood, was the son of, and just start it from her perspective and be like, you know, Eleanor Dashwood had a problem, right? Her problem was she was poor, and here's why she was poor, right? But that's not the perspective that we get at the beginning. Instead, we get brought into this whole
cultural, societal situation of what painted this world that she's in,
right?
And you get that a lot more throughout this one too. You know, like when Edward is talking about his desire to be a member of the leader of a church. Like he just wants a quiet pastoral life, but that's not what his mother wants. Like then you have this whole like familial expectation of greatness and class and what means good and what is not acceptable, and military is acceptable but church is not, and all these different levels and rules and explanations. It just helps you see how that world is so restrictive. So having something as pure as love bloom between these characters and have it somehow come to fruition is so much more satisfying, because you understand how restrictive the culture that they're in is.
Yes.
So I think that's why the payoff of Jane Austen's marriages at the end is so big and so, perpetuates so well, is because we could not in any way understand how that would have worked out at the beginning. That wasn't allowed. And it's made very clear that it's not allowed.
Yeah. And Sense and Sensibility, I think, is more, I think it contains the most complex and robust exploration of social boundaries in relationships of any of her books. It comes up in other places too, of course. I'm not saying it's unique to Sense and Sensibility, but as far as like where are lines drawn, why are lines drawn, what's appropriate, as you say, like whether the combination of like Mrs. Farrar's expectations on Edward, right, to like Edward's scandalous secret first engagement crossing different lines, and that's not okay. But what about a girl who's so like a girl who's poor and of a not a good family, that's not okay. But how about a girl who's poor but of a good family, like Eleanor, right? What about a girl who's not poor but not of a good family, right? What about and how do you define, well, as you said, why is the army okay but the church is not, right? Like what is it? And those are both professions. Like to be a professional man in this culture means to have one of four. There are four professions. There's the church, the army, the law, and medicine. Those are the four professions, and that's kind of like to be anything other than that, to have a job. If you have a job, there are those four professions, and then there's everything else is just to be like a laborer, essentially. Like to be like if you're a shopkeeper, right, or even a shop owner,
but for so many of these people, there is no work. You are just a gentleman. You live off of your fortune.
Exactly. So being professional people could mix with the gentleman, the upper class, right? But they were still separate, right? And so here, when you're talking about, because you're right, Mrs. Farrar makes a big deal about like the army versus the church or the law, right? They're choosing among the professions. They're all professional men. It's perfectly respectable to be a clergyman. But it's not fashionable enough for her, right? So it's like it's a very fine distinction that she's making between the church and the army. It really is about fashion and an outward look.
But she is choosing that over her son's happiness, for sure.
Yes. I mean, it really is about, it's something almost as shallow as, but you will look snappier in a military uniform than you will in like a cassock, or
could get invited to more balls or have a better circle, all those things that somebody might care about.
You'll travel more, it'll be yes. I mean, it's but anyway, so the way in which this book explores those kinds of frontiers and what crossing those frontiers, either personally, like moving from one class or subclass to another, what that means for you and your reputation, what crossing it by marriage, would mean in either direction, like for a woman to marry down or a guy to marry down, like, and that's like all of those things are being explored in this book. So anyway, yes, this is Anglican clergy who are allowed to marry JJ. That's right. Yep. So, and I would just say, JJ, we're still very much at a time in the early 19th century where if we're talking about Catholic clergy, that would be like, that's a totally different like to become a, I mean, you might as well like talk about, I mean, seriously, like talk about societal suicide to become a Catholic. Good grief. Yeah.
Yes, Philip is the same as Mr. Collins. So yeah.
Exactly. Just the same as Mr. Collins. Yes.
And being given a parish and having a space, and you know, there's a certain amount of
and an income,
societal acceptance that comes along with that. Yeah, income, influence.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep. Anyway, okay. So this is where we begin in the book, right? And it is indirectly, it does, even by the way that the female characters who are going to be the protagonists of the entire story only get introduced to us at the very end of the chapter, is in itself, Maggie, like another testimony to what you were describing. Like the marginalization of women in this society is being kind of gently demonstrated by how, after all of this discussion of these different and complicated legal and financial transactions among the menfolk, here are the women. And here are the women who are going to actually have to be living with these, because all the men die. Like all those men who are doing those things, except for the 2-year-old boy who has grown up to Mr. John Dashwood with the horrible wife Fanny, they're all out of the picture. And now the women have to deal with the consequences.
But this is where, I mean, there's so many elements of Jane Austen that I think are phenomenal, but she gives so many different layers to each of her characters. So each character doesn't just do one thing. They will have multiple things going on that show you their character, you know, what they care about, what they'll stand for, what they won't. I'm thinking even here's a small example of Colonel Brandon, that like he's obviously a man of great reputation professionally, but we also know that he, you know, has a good heart because he looked after a ward that got herself into trouble, which we later find out was connected to another character. So that person isn't just a love interest, that person's also a bad guy. And so everybody has these different roles to play. And we have pages and pages and pages to figure this out. And I imagine a whole lot of gasping and shock when these books were read out loud with their sisters or something in a parlor back in the day, because it just feels like a big old reveal of like, and then he did what? But we don't have that kind of time in a text. So like the ways that those different elements are explained filmically are lovely. But that's why we have to start with just introductions, because there's just too much. There's just too much. There's just too much.
Okay, so thinking about the film adaptations then.
And the introduction we've got from Sense and Sensibility, we've just established like it's societal, it's cultural, it's rules, it's foundations.
It's
like
male focused. I mean, it's
Yeah, you got to know what you're getting into because it's real complicated, and that feels like the kind of main gist from the text. It's a while till we get into dialogue and start to understand who the characters are.
Yeah, exactly. So in the film versions, in both, so we're going to be talking about two different film adaptations. The 1995, I believe. That's a film, by the way, that I always remember the year of. For the very good reason that it was one of the first dates I ever went on with my wife. So I remember 1995. I remember where I was when that film came out. One. I remember I remember the movie theater I saw it in. Anyway, so
that was 1995.
That was 1995.
And Emma Thompson did the adaptation as well, so she wrote it.
Yes.
And directed it.
I think so. She was like the whole show on that one. I think she did direct it.
And I'm pretty sure she won Best Adapted Screenplay, and Kate Winslet was nominated or won Best Supporting Actress.
Did Emma Thompson win 2 Oscars for that? I think there might have been 2, but I can't remember.
I'll check while we keep talking.
I don't remember this.
And the other one we're looking at is the 2008 BBC adaptation.
Yeah. Oh, it's right. Directed by Ang Lee. She did the screenplay, and then and she starred in it and did the screenplay, and Ang Lee did the direction. Yeah.
I won't look up awards right now. We'll do that later.
Okay, excellent.
Yeah, Ang Lee. Sorry, Ang Lee.
Yeah, no worries. Apologies to Ang Lee. Okay. So
intros.
So at the openings. One interesting thing that both of them, so by the way, I couldn't believe it when I was looking it up, and I was looking up at the 2008 BBC miniseries adaptation, and realized I've never seen it. Like, I missed that one. And
That's epic.
Okay, I know what my wife and I are watching next, because man, like,
I love that there's something I've seen before you have.
2008 BBC adaptation with Mark Gatiss playing John Dashwood, and
and
Howard
Dominic
Stark
Cooper as Willoughby.
Yeah.
It's pretty good.
Okay. All right. I'm interested. No, the cast looked fascinating. Actually, I was. Yeah. Anyway, okay. So,
and I think it's like $3.99 on iTunes right now. So have fun.
I'm totally watching it. Okay. So, but I did watch the opening, so that we can talk about the opening. This is another fun thing about the case study, is just, so I can't talk about where they go in the film.
We don't have to set aside 6 hours. We just need like 10 minutes.
Exactly. Okay. So both of them get rid of old Mr. Norland completely. Right?
Yep,
both of them
involved.
Streamline the opening situation.
Which frankly makes a lot of sense in adaptation.
So much sense.
Not necessary. It's going to confuse the audience. Just jump straight in.
So much sense. We get so like we basically start both films on the deathbed of Henry Dashwood.
Almost.
Start the plot of both
of them.
Start the
plot.
We start the story begins.
We see something else in the 2008 one we'll get to in a second, but the story begins.
Yes, the story begins on the deathbed of Mr. Henry Dashwood, the younger.
So again,
one.
Establishing the issue of finances.
Yes. So both of them do establish the basic fact that of Henry's helplessness to provide for his wife and daughters because of the restrictions of his own inheritance, the way in which that the estate has been entailed. Which, by the way, same situation with the Bennets in Pride and Prejudice, right? Mr. Bennet is restricted. The estate is entailed. If he had a son, he could give the estate to his son, but in default of male issue, the estate must go by the rules of his father's will to his brother's child, who is Mr. Collins.
And both adaptations, I think, very quickly give a lot of strength to Fanny, the wife.
Yes.
Who, I got it in the text. You could see what she was doing. It it revealed the character. But the 1995 Fanny, I forget her name.
Oh my goodness.
Was just so dang brilliant in how she controls that narrative that I don't see any way the 2008 version wasn't affected by that. Yeah. Like, those two scenes are so good. And
the
so
multiple scenes of Fanny and John Dashwood riding in the carriage with her little lapdog, her little almost hairless lapdog that she's stroking like a Bond villain the whole time. Yes. Harriet Walter. Thank you. Yes. Yeah. Yes. That so that process. So the storyline that you're referring to, which is very much the focal point of those early scenes in both film versions, is how the dynamic which happens in the book, right, where John makes a promise to his father on his father's deathbed that he will help his sisters and provide for them. And he, in the book, he resolves that he's going to give them each £1,000. He's gonna dedicate £3,000 to helping support his sisters, and he informs his wife of his intention, and they have this discussion where she basically,
and like a beautiful manipulator, she starts by saying, "Well, of course you are. You're so generous. However,
yes, ... yes," and she gives all the reasons why, and then in the end, she basically has he decides that he's going to give them nothing. Essentially, he's just going to give them occasional gifts or presents or advice, essentially,
or like introductions to society. So basically nothing.
Yeah, he's going to give them nothing at all, while still convincing himself that he's fulfilling his father's dying wish. But now the thing that interested me most about this is that happens in chapter 2 in the book. It's not where Jane Austen begins the story. it gets there pretty quickly. Like, I'm not saying it's not at the start, but it isn't the opening note of the story. It's whereas it gets, not only do we cut out old Mr. Dashwood, it really, even like all of the legal stuff, like we care about the will in as much as it informs the situation, but really the story begins with the deathbed promise of John to his father, and then how that gets, and then we get introduced to how horrible Fanny is by watching her sort of talk them down here.
Yeah, I don't feel like you don't get the emotion quite as easily in Sense and Sensibility. I think it's there because in both films you absolutely see the devastation and the relationship between the girls and their dead father, and you feel an actual real strong sense of loss in the music that Marianne plays and all that kind of stuff.
Yes.
And I think that's there in the text, but it's not quite so overt,
Yeah, it is.
It is much more dry.
Not where, again, thinking about this question of like, where do they put us? Like, where do these stories put us as viewers at the start, right?
Yeah.
Austen puts us in this dry and helpless place. Again, I think it's almost like a kind of experiment. Like, I genuinely think that chapter 1 is boring on purpose, essentially. Like, she obviously can write more engagingly than that. But I think she wants us to be at a place where we're like, hang on, I got to read that page. Did I understand how the provisions of this will working in? Wait, who's related to whom? And who's leaving what to whom? And why does this happen? That's where she wants us to be at the beginning of the story. She wants us to be
frustrated and stuck.
Frustrated, confused, and puzzled as to why these girls are left helpless.
Yeah.
Because that puts us in exactly... So now when, when they're expressing their frustration, we're with them. Right, we feel that.
That's what Jane Austen had to do to tell her story to get us to that point.
Yes,
that's not necessarily what the filmmakers had to do. So again, like how to tell your story in a different way.
Right. So with both of the filmmakers start with the sort of like the emotional appeal of the deathbed scene, right? The father is dying, and his son comes to his bedside just before he dies, and the father lay very urgently, right? Often, in the 95 version, the father is looking right into the camera when he says, like, you must do this. Promise me you will do this. Right? I mean, it's like, okay, sir. Yes.
Well, and the 2008 version, all the girls are there. Yes. So that conversation is happening while they're witnessing it. And you see the wife's eyes, like, look to him being like, you promised. I heard it. You promised.
Yes. Yeah, you're right. Whereas we see the father absolutely in profile. Like, we're looking at the side of his head as he's speaking it up into the air, asking for the promise, which that difference in perspective struck me as a really profound difference. But you're right. The reason for that we're looking at this like the daughters, right?
Yeah.
We're like sitting with Eleanor because she's seeing him talking to somebody else. The appeal is not to them, and therefore not to us as the audience. Yeah. And that choice. And man, talk about your examples of things that films can do and books can't do, right? To deliver the same line, but just literally from a different perspective. Like seeing it straight on like this, or seeing it in profile like you're overhearing it said to somebody else.
And just the reception too, like just how I viewed it, knowing that somebody else heard the promise, it changes how that is accepted. Absolutely. Because when it was just the two of them in the room, somehow that felt like that was a sincere promise. He is going to do his best. And then Fanny did something messy. Whereas when the girls were in the room, it looked immediately like we didn't believe that was going to happen, and she already knew that it was going to get dubious. So she's already flagging to us that something shady is going to happen. Yes. But we didn't get that in the 1995 version.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the kinds of cues that we get as to how to and so thinking of the 95 version then for a second. Us watching John crumble as Fanny wears him down over the next couple, like it's one sort of scene, but the setting keeps changing, as it's like they're having this one continuous conversation,
and,
but it's obviously something that's broken up over days probably, right?
Which is beautiful because that just aids the idea that she's a master manipulator, that
yes.
she's just trickling these lines out as appropriate through their everyday life, not sitting him down over a table and having a conversation, just sneaking right. things in as they're moving here and there.
Yep. And every time it shifts him a little bit more. But watching that erosion, we are very profoundly hit both by aversion to Fanny and by disgust at John because of how that appeal was directed to us originally. Like, we felt in this deep and visceral way the appeal for the promise to help the Dashwood girls, right? And so there's a way in which, again, having been placed so actively shoulder to shoulder with John, right, to watch him act like this, when it's like, you know, the perspective I feel placed in as a viewer is I feel like saying to John, that's not what our father told us. Right?
Exactly. You know,
like, you were betraying, like you feel the betrayal personally.
Yeah.
Not because you're seeing it from the perspective of the girls, but because you're like, you know what he said, you felt the appeal, and so you are very painfully aware of how far short he is falling of that. And so in this way, the 95 version parallels the book in waiting to introduce the girls, right? Just as she doesn't introduce the girls until the end of the chapter, right? Or all of the women, I should say, Mrs. Dashwood as well. So too, the 95 version, I mean, we get Fanny, so I'm not saying we get no feminine presence at all, but we get the deathbed and then John's, you know, the corrosion of and you know, gradual vacating of John's promise before we ever even meet the girls. So that is the reality, that is the perspective from which we are first introduced to Eleanor and Marianne and Margaret and Mrs. Dashwood in the 95 film. And that's very different, as you say, from having them present in that moment and literally seeing it from their visual point of view in the 2008 version. That's it does really frame the thing very differently. But speaking of framing things very differently, we cannot continue to neglect the actual opening sequence of
let's not spend a ton of time on it, but you have to at least acknowledge it. So there's an opening sequence in the 2008 that is just basically soft porn. Like, what?
Like, so Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen, and it's just like this very sensual, firelit erotica.
Very sensual, and nothing is like, you know, I'm thinking about in terms of writers and ratings and things like that. No, it's like it's all PG-13.
It is PG. Like, in fact, like TV PG came up on the screen during the erotic moment.
Somehow it feels way more risque than that, though, because of what they don't show, and they talk about her age. So it's the seduction of Willoughby to the ward of
and we don't see his face. We hear his voice, but he's kind of whispering and urging. It's not Whew. I mean,
it's one of the first lines is like, but I forget her name, Mrs. Edwards or whatever. Mrs. Edwards thinks you're a child, but we know better, don't we?
Yes.
So like immediately it's this super shady, inappropriate situation going on as he unties her blouse, and you're like, where am I? Because I'm not in Jane Austen.
And you were getting, I mean, so much focus, like the camera is entirely focused on the woman's skin, so we're seeing her from it's from behind her shoulder, so you're seeing her neck and the side of her face and her shoulder and arm and a little and then cutting to her back to watch him pulling the ties free that go down her back. But I mean, just like the camera is just focused very sensuously on her skin and his caresses of her skin.
It's very much an extreme close-up, but when you have an extreme close-up, it's almost always of somebody's facial expression to convey an emotion or a situation that they're in. So to have that kind of intensity onto like a shoulder feels very I shouldn't be here or super sensual, and that's kind of
Yes.
what both are going for. I will say it's beautifully shot. Like, it's
It
a
is beautifully
really
shot.
lovely scene. It's just so jarring for that to be the first thing when you're expecting Sense and Sensibility. So if you know nothing of the story, maybe that was just their
Nothing
like
is true. You're
push
like,
for
what
that.
kind of movie am I watching
Yeah.
right now?
Like, maybe that was just their push for like the after 9 p.m. crowd to be
Right.
satisfied that this is
Jane
a
Austen
little,
After Dark is what we were getting there.
yeah,
Yeah.
like there's something in this for me too. Hey, hey.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
But
so
otherwise, it's a bit
here's,
jarring.
yeah. So here's one of the things that, so on the one hand, I, I don't know, again, I haven't watched this whole production yet. So I will, but I haven't yet.
And I
Again,
haven't in a
this
long
was me.
time.
It was, and it was this scene that I was watching because I thought I'd seen it. I'm like, oh, the BBC Sense and Sensibility. I think I've seen that. I mean, I've seen so many Austen
You're like,
adaptations; they all run together. So I'm like, okay, I think I've seen it. So I start it, and I'm getting the firelight, erotica, and I'm like, I have not seen this. This does not look familiar, and I'm sure I'd have remembered it. But anyway, yeah. So anyway, one of the things that really struck me was they literally had the title, like they were running the opening credits during this scene. It's not like it was just a scene and then they cut to the credits after that. That's not how it worked. It was like the opening credits were running during the sensual firelight scene, which means there was a moment when the title of the thing where Sense and Sensibility appeared like over this like woman's shoulder whose like very follicles I could see in the extreme close up, I mean, so and if I'm remembering, because it struck me I only saw it once, so I might be incorrect, but I think that the phrase, like the title Sense and Sensibility came up like was being shown over like his fingers caressing, like his fingers sensuously sliding over her skin.
I don't remember when that happens, but that sounds about right.
The reason that I was noticing that in particular was that, so the title of this book is a very carefully chosen title. Because the play between sense and sensibility, and those are both vocabulary terms from the early 19th century, which neither one of which means exactly what we might think it means. We don't use the word sensible at all in the way that they're using it in this anymore. We still use the word sense mostly in that way, but not very often. But anyway, Mo Dillon says, yeah, Maureen says, sensation and sensibility. Yes, it was kind of like that.
Sensuality.
Sense and sensuality.
I'm sure that one exists, but that's not.
Actually, don't Google that. Is my recommendation. But
believe it or not, it was BBC.
Yeah, BBC, PG. It was like rated TV PG. Anyway, that sensibility is about, so to be a person of sense is to be guided by your reason and intellect. To be a person of sensibility is to be guided by your feelings and your emotions. So you have, if you're a person of great sensibility, it means you have strong feelings and you feel and perceive things very acutely. Whereas a person of sense is someone who can kind of maintain a more dispassionate distance and judge things by their intellect. And of course, primarily, these two things map very clearly onto Eleanor and Marianne, the two oldest daughters of the Dashwood family.
There's even that line where Mrs. Dashwood says it to Marianne when after she judges Edward's reading as being dispassionate, and says, "But he does not have your sensibilities."
Yes. Yes.
So it's a very much he's just not as impassioned as you are. It's a very different meaning of it.
Exactly. So anyway, so back to the sense and sensuality scene that we were looking at. I thought it was interesting because one of this vocabulary issue that we were just talking about, it's one of the interesting framing challenges of this thing. If you're going to title the movie Sense and Sensibility, you have to in some way deal with the fact that most modern viewers aren't going to actually know what those words mean in relationship to the story. Like, part of your job is to explain what that means, right? And so just seeing the words sense and sensibility physically juxtaposed over this very sensual scene, I was like, oh, right, okay. Ooh. So we're leaning, so and again, I know nothing about the rest of the production, so I am in this case actually a kind of a pure example of where we're placed at the beginning of the show, because I don't know where the rest of the show is going to take us. But where I felt placed at the beginning of that show was like, oh, so that's what we mean by sensibility. Okay, so we're I mean, I don't think anyone is going to think that sense is involved. I mean, unless you're thinking about senses, right? Like one's senses, or
I think that's probably what they would be implying there if we're talking about a physical touch. And it's like, well, you can have the physical sensation, right, or you can have the sensible grown-up decision.
Yeah. Like, is it reversed? Right, actually, like, because it's a scene of what I think most modern people would think of as sensuality, right?
Right.
But sensuality is very different from sense in the in the 19th century sense. And of course, a modern person might the only time we use the word sensible still at all is actually in a way which almost means what they meant by sense. Like, be sensible, we might say.
That sounds sensible.
Right, or that, both of which is like, be logical, think about it clearly, is what we mean. Whereas again, it meant almost exactly the opposite back then. So I was having this moment when I was seeing the title superimposed over the scene where I'm like, okay, are we in fact suggesting that sensuality and even sexuality is something that like underlies both sense and sensibility? Or like, are we, because there is a kind of there's a way in which sexuality or sensuality is a kind of third term, even in the book, right? You know, there's that, it's an issue, like sexuality is an issue, and again, even sensuality, the way in which sensibility in Marianne's sense is also associated with sensuality as well, and where those boundaries are. It's another set of boundaries that the book is very interested in exploring, different degrees of transgression of, right? I mean, the question of Willoughby's relationship to, you know, the girl that we meet in scene 1 of that film, the Willoughby's relationship to Marianne, Willoughby's relationship to the woman he's engaged to in London later in the story. Yeah. Miss Grey, isn't that it?
Right.
Anyway, right. Miss Boring, basically. She couldn't actually call her Miss Boring, so she just called her Miss Grey.
Right.
But anyway, like, all of those things are different kinds of like explorations of transgressions of that. I mean, how far has their sensibility led to sensuality, right? Or I mean, there's a big question right there with Marianne as with the rest of them. Anyway, it's very interesting. But yeah, so I was floored by the opening of that film, and it, again, I don't think it is not in any way. But so here's a question: is it true to the book? On the one hand, I was like, well, that's not what I was expecting, and that's not how the book starts. But I was like, you know what? It's in the book.
It happens.
It happens. Yeah, I mean, and not only that, but it's important. And I was thinking, again, I don't know how it's going to happen in the rest of the. I don't know what they're going to do. But foregrounding it to sort of start off with this idea of sexual transgression, and to have that kind of loom, and we don't know the connection, right? We segue straight from that to Mr. Henry Dashwood's deathbed scene with John, right? And like, what connection, what association is there between these two things? No idea.
No,
we're given no clue.
But real interesting, put that in as the most important thing, you know, because for us, we don't find out about that till much later, and it does hit, but it doesn't feel quite so shady because we don't have the dialogue of that scene. We just hear about that scene happening. Yes. We don't actually see that scene. So having it up front and having the two characters actually speak puts so much more import onto it. So, yeah.
Well, and I have to admit that one of the things that I am anticipating, again, I haven't watched the rest of it. One of the things that I am anticipating, one of the things that when I watch the rest of it, I am going to be watching very, very carefully, is what Willoughby says and how he acts to Marianne and the extent to which they're paralleling that. Like, I know from the book that there is the scene when he cuts off a lock of her hair to keep. Willoughby does. And so I'm already guessing that we're going to see that from the same angle. We're going to see the back of her shoulder and her neck and head, and we're going to see his hands, just as we saw them in the opening sequence, reaching across and sensuously, probably trailing across her shoulder and clipping a lock of her hair. And by contextualizing that scene with this earlier scene of obvious transgression and the way that, again, it's not even obvious that we don't know. I know because I've read the book, but we don't know that it's Willoughby.
No, but we have now a visual match if that's how they do it.
If that's how they do it, yeah.
It's like a comedian callback. Like, you have this thing that you're going to go, oh wait, I've seen. Oh no,
that's what I'm expecting. I don't know if it's going to happen, but that's what I'm waiting for.
I don't remember, to be honest.
That's what I'm waiting for. Maybe they'll do it a different. Maybe they won't make it as obvious as that. Maybe they're trying to hide who it was. Who. Though that seems
not with that
odd.
Voice.
Yeah,
they weren't hiding it.
They weren't hiding the voice. Yeah. Anyway, but it's just by placing that at the beginning, they have made a fundamental change in how we approach the whole thing. I mean, I'm going to
be... Not a fundamental change in plot, but very much a fundamental change in expectation,
Yes.
So, oh, you're starting with that bold move. Okay. It does change your own engagement with the story. Like, I'm not sitting back. And also, everybody coming to this, because I remember being here when this came out, it was a big old deal because it was a BBC adaptation of a Jane Austen.
Yeah.
Well, the 6-hour Pride and Prejudice BBC Jane Austen adaptation is like one of the most beloved things on the planet.
Yeah.
So to come out with something like that, the hype was real high. They knew they had a big audience. I think it came out Christmas break. So like the country had stopped. Everybody was watching this. This is what the Christmas special was, or Easter special. I can't remember which one. But yeah, so then to start so strongly with that, that's a real pointed decision.
It is. And now here's the other thing, again, to come back to the thing I keep coming back to today about, is it faithful to the book, right? Really easy to look at this and be like, oh my gosh, what a huge departure from the book. Like that, Jane Austen would never lead with that. And yet, again, I don't know what the effect of it is because I haven't seen the rest of the thing. But here's one of the things I can't help but think. Because of that opening scene, we are going to see Mr. Willoughby pretty much from the beginning if we recognize his voice, right? And if his mannerisms in any way remind us of the seductor dude in the first sequence, the scene of which ends with the girl's face, tears trailing down, looking out the window in grayscale, in a moonlit night as he gallops away, right? With a voiceover of her saying, when will I see you again? And him deflecting when she will see him again, right? So when we see Willoughby and when we recognize his voice, we're going to have a strong negative we're going to be creeped out by Willoughby. We're going to be on our guard against Willoughby from the very, very beginning. And now I could see many people saying that's a huge departure from the book. Except, is it? Because here's one of the things that often happens. This is, I think, one of the biggest challenges of Jane Austen adaptations, is that the cultural expectations are so different for a modern audience compared to her audience. And you frequently see Jane Austen adaptations struggling with, how do we induce the same kind and level of reaction in the audience as Jane Austen would have induced in her audience
It's looking for the same impact.
Yeah, you can't say the same thing. One of the classic examples of this, and we're not going to do Mansfield Park, but in the Mansfield Park that came out in the
we might have to do Mansfield
we might
Park.
have to do Mansfield Park. I don't I don't even remember enough to distinguish which Mansfield Park it was. It was the feature film version. I don't remember which decade this one came out in. This was after I was married and my
early
kids.
2000s, I think.
Yeah, early 2000s, I think.
Big theatrical one, yeah.
Yeah.
Which I really liked, but it was very different.
Very different. The moment when Mary Crawford says the shocking thing. So Mary Crawford says this shocking thing that opens to Edmund and everybody else what her true character is. Like, it makes it so that Edmund can't deny it anymore. In that film, they added something to it. Like, she couldn't just say, because the thing that she said in the book was that the sister who had committed adultery and left her husband and run off with another man adulterously. The thing in the book that she said, which shocks Edmund to his core, is basically that maybe it wasn't such a horrible thing that she had done, right? And I think it seemed pretty clear to me that in the film adaptation, they're like, we can't count on the fact that if that's all she says, people are going to have the correct reaction, like that it's going to shock them. You know, it can be like, well, yeah, okay, right. She was married. That's not a good look, right? But like whatever. I mean, just in our world, that is not like shock you to your core as it was in the early 19th century. So they had to add on like a statement about her, like basically looking forward to the death of, they had to pile on her looking forward to the death of the older brother, right? Like make her look more explicitly heartless and everything. And that change, again, was that a change from the book? Yeah, it was a big change from the book. But again, I felt like they were trying to replicate the impact because the societal values have changed in so many ways from Jane Austen's time to ours that you can't just replicate the dialogue and expect it's going to hit people in the same way. So back to Willoughby, right? Yes, that opening seduction sequence in the 2008 version arms us against Willoughby. Like, we're ready to hate on Willoughby from the moment he comes in if we recognize him, right? If we're prompted in any way to recognize him, and even if we catch his voice. But in the original book, everybody is like, there's so many red flags about Willoughby, like that anyone in that society would have picked up as red flags from the beginning. Eleanor is like, she's willing to think the best, right? And there are ways that she likes him too, but and it's still a shock.
More hidden in the 95 version.
Yes, like, it's much more hidden in the 95 version.
Trust him. Like, there's a few things that make you a little skeezy, but mostly it's just Colonel Brandon's reaction, and we don't really understand that because it's not explained for a long time. So, you get more of a reveal of Willoughby being a bad guy. Yeah. Whereas in the other two, the original and the 2008, you kind of know he's a shady creature, and then it just comes to fruition.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, I'm not sure. Again, I haven't seen it yet, but I am not sure that the change from the text, like the change to foreground that and to totally change how we view Willoughby from the beginning, I'm not positive. It's not obvious to me from watching those two opening scenes that in the end, the depiction of Willoughby and our relationship to Willoughby is going to actually be fundamentally different from the book. It may end up being, I don't know. But again, it's a fascinating example of a change that they're making a change, but that doesn't actually answer the faithfulness question.
Well, and also if we're talking like tools and tool belt, it's a really good example of like, well, which element are you looking at in this exact moment? Because if you're just, sorry, my camera keeps going off, but I'm still here. Okay. If you're just looking at Willoughby, then yes, this is quite appropriate in a really unique way. Mm-hmm. But if you're looking at big picture, this is a really different tone we're setting. This is a very different 100%. Engaging the audience starting point than, again, think about like the Joe Wright Pride and Prejudice. Yes. Like this is a different vibe, but they're really similar films in terms of like story and their telling and stuff. But this is a very different vibe. So coming in with a strong punch, being like, haha, you thought you knew what you're getting. Yeah. You don't.
Yeah.
Now I've frozen my finger in the air.
to alter a quotation very out of context, we find in the 2008 version that this is definitely a kissing book. I mean, this is okay. This is a story about, you know, desire and sex and all of those. That's important. Like that's where we start. That's the frame of all of this,
which is totally different from the text that gave us legalese.
Exactly. It's about 1,000 miles away from old Mr. Dashwood and the legal issues of his
and that's tone, but plot kind of on board.
Yeah.
So you can see some of the difficulties you have here, but also some of the really cool things you get to do. This is why, you know, there's so many different adaptations, because people get to make different decisions. Doesn't mean you have to like them. You just notice them.
Yeah, but it is interesting. I mean, that's the thing that I am most looking forward to as I you know, prepare at some point, which I hope we'll get a chance to do in the next couple of months, watch this production with my wife. I will be interested to see the thing I'm most on the top of my list that I'm looking for is how they handle Willoughby's character and how they place us in relationship to Willoughby, and our reactions to Willoughby compared to other people's reactions to Willoughby. I mean, I feel like I'm being prompted to have more of a, you know, almost like analog to like a horror movie, you know, like, no, don't open the closet kind of, you know, like when, you know, Mrs. Dashwood and Marianne and even Eleanor like Willoughby and oh, isn't he nice? And being like, no, oh, he's horrible. Like that's a very different, you know, how much is the production going to lean into that, right? I mean, is going to really follow that up from that first scene? And how also does this theme of sensuality and sexuality, to what extent is that going to be like drawn out, even of the, I mean, because again, it's clearly an issue. It's not like they're wrong, right? Why do we think Edward got engaged to Lucy Steele? Come on now. Like, why do you think he got engaged to her? Right? Like deep platonic relationship? I doubt it. Right? I mean,
they were at school and had a lot of hormones.
Yeah, exactly. He was young. They were young together. They spent a lot of time together. There were hormones involved. Like, yes, like that's, you know, but again, you know, so similarities and contrasts, lots of different ways, as I said, in which Austen in the book is exploring transgressions of boundaries. But yeah, so with that frame, like having been brought into this in that, like with that erotica sequence at the beginning of the film, how are we now going to, like, how am I going to be looking at, how does the film going to ask me to look at like Lucy Steele or even Eleanor and Edward and all of these things compared to thinking about how, for instance, Eleanor and Edward's relationship is contextualized so beautifully in the Emma Thompson version, right? Anyway, so yeah,
I think we'll have to revisit some of these purely just because it's a fun thing for us to talk about, and we've only talked about intros. But I would also like to do like shot analysis or scene analysis, you know. So if we look at like a sentence and look at the two different ways that sentence was then depicted visually, and you get to see the different techniques, because even if you just start watching these two adaptations with lighting in mind, your brain is blown in like the third scene. Like there's so many different ways they're telling story with just light.
Ooh, and that reminded me, because again, this is just one of those many things I've learned from you, right? So I was proud of myself because I felt like I had my Maggie Parke hat on when I was watching the 2008. The lighting and coloring, like the really warm oranges of the firelight sequence with the erotica at the beginning. And then we cut, and then like he's leaving, right? So now we're in like grayscale as she's looking through the window and he's riding off. And then it shifts from warm orange to grayscale to almost black. Like when the deathbed scene, there's like no light at all. It was like mostly black and kind of faint grays as John Dashwood was coming in. And then we get to the deathbed scene and it's firelight again, it's bright orange again. So like the juxtaposition of the like sensuous scene and the deathbed scene, I was like, whoa, holy cow.
And the emotional ride that took you on, because
Yes.
firelight in that scene is not the same as firelight in that scene.
Yeah.
So you needed that kind of visual breath to go from gray to black back to red, because that's not allowed to mean the same thing.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
But yet I felt, I mean, it was obviously very different, but I also felt the connection. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, it was really fascinating. But again, that's another really fascinating kind of tool that film has, that you can't do that same exact thing in books. But anyway, really, really cool, really fascinating. It would be fun to go back and do another case study, to do a scene analysis of these same sets, like of books and of books and films.
Yeah, I think we'd pick the scene and maybe find the YouTube clip that we could share the week before, so people could be like, okay, get to know this scene. We're doing a deep dive, because it basically be a close reading in 3 different ways, which would be fun.
That would be fun. Yeah. No,
and this is so much better when you've got visuals to show up. We just don't have the time to prep that stuff at the moment.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Awesome. So next week, we're having our special Return to Moria. Yeah, compare the depictions of Tom Bombadil. JJ. Exactly. Yeah.
No problem.
Well, I mean, unfortunately, the only option we have is the greatest, without question, the greatest film adaptation of Tom Bombadil ever, which is the Soviet Lord of the Rings.
See, I went straight to Leonard Nimoy.
Well, but he didn't do Tom Bombadil.
You're right.
He didn't do Tom Bombadil. You're right. There's a kind of parallel between the Ballad of Bilbo Baggins.
There's something in that.
I hear that.
The Soviet one.
I hear that. But anyway, I say that because it's the only film adaptation that includes Tom Bombadil that's ever been done.
I think if you and I are ever back in Studio Lab and it's a late night thing, that's the one that we should.
Oh yeah, do it.
Dive on.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so next week, Return to Moria. So we're going to be joined by the Return to Moria game development team, talking about adapting Tolkien's story. And this, of course, is a story which takes place in the Fourth Age. So this is after the Lord of the Rings is done. We'll talk about what's involved. We'll talk about the relationship between text and game and how that worked out. So again, we're going to be joined by the game director, the head writer, and the art director. And we're going to be talking about what the process of adapting video games is like, some of the different advantages and challenges of video game adaptation compared to others.
They had a rule book, how they utilized you. Like, I'm real interested in all that progression process stuff.
Yeah. No, it's going to be fun to talk about. So we'll be at our normal time at 4 p.m. Eastern, back to 9 p.m. Your time, Maggie, as this is the 1 week in which our daylight savings times don't line up between the UK.
Yeah, I'm a little more awake than I normally am. I feel like I yawned a tiny bit less, but
exactly, it's less late than normal, which is good for your sleep, but not necessarily as good for your child. So go ahead.
It was touch and go whether I was going to make the time. I was texting Corey at 7:56, being like, "I think she's asleep."
Exactly. Very good. Anyway, so next week, Return to Moria. So do if you get a chance, go to YouTube. You can look at some of the trailers. There's a bunch of information out there. You could just go to the game site and see the trailers to sort of see how they're presenting it, how they talk about the story is a really interesting beginning point. As I said, I recommend go to Nerd of the Rings treatment of the game. He's done some interviews and discussions. You can look up some interesting game streams and things to see more what the gameplay is like. So some options to familiarize yourself with it, even if you haven't gotten a chance to buy the game and play it yourself. It's available in PC right now, Xbox coming soon, PS2 or PlayStation coming later in December. So I believe. All right. Anyway, so that's what we're going to be talking about next week, and then we'll come back. We had said we want to do Emma, right?
Okay. Yep.
So let's do Emma, the recent Emma film, and Clueless.
And Would that Clueless. Be fun? Wait, which Emma's? The Gwyneth Paltrow?
No, the new one. The recent,
new one.
The one that was just like 3 years ago.
Yeah,
or something.
That was really good, but not the Gwyneth Paltrow one at all.
Well, see, I'm tempted to do the Gwyneth Paltrow one, but I'm trying to stick to the same number of things to talk about.
I know, but it's tough to not reference that one because it's kind of the one that most people know.
Yeah, it is the sort of the most
Well, let's do all of them, but like Clueless is so different. We haven't done a
so
modern
but
retelling, so
for that reason, it's a really interesting kind
oh
of case
yeah, I
study.
definitely want to talk about it.
Yeah.
But like maybe we keep two that are like in tone and then like wild card.
Well, we'll get wild and crazy then and talk about 4 separate texts for our
We
Emma
might
discussion.
run over a tiny bit.
Like we did today. Okay. Anyway, awesome. Thanks so much, everybody. Looking forward to our special session next time, and we will see you guys soon. Thanks, everybody. Bye now.
Night.